My grandmother asked me to care for her estate after she passed. But as I sorted through her belongings, I found proof she'd been working with my father's enemies to ruin us. My grandmother, Minerva, was my rock. She was the one person in my life who seemed stable, consistent, and proud of our family. She raised me in a way, stepping in when my parents couldn't, or wouldn't. She taught me discipline, self-respect, and the importance of family. I was the golden grandchild, her perfect Vance. She told me I'd inherit the family legacy someday. I believed her. Turns out, I didn't really know her at all. 3 years ago, Minerva passed away at the age of 91. She was sharp right up until the end, even bossing around the hospice nurses when she was too weak to sit up. In her will, she left me Redwood Hollow, our family's estate in Hannibal, Missouri. It's an old, grand house perched on the edge of the Mississippi River, surrounded by massive redwood trees that make the place look like it's out of a Gothic novel. The house has been in our family for generations, and Minerva loved it more than anything. Her last wish for me, spelled out in a handwritten letter, was to restore Redwood Hollow to its rightful glory. That's how she put it. She wanted me to go through her belongings, sort out the clutter, and turn the house back into the shining beacon it once was. I thought it was a blessing, a chance to honor her memory. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first few weeks of sorting through the house were emotional but uneventful. Minerva was meticulous, so most of her belongings were neatly organized. Her clothes still smelled faintly of lavender. Her favorite books were stacked on the bedside table, bookmarked in the middle like she'd never intended to stop reading them. I found a box of family photos in the attic and spent hours looking through them, seeing my dad as a young boy and my grandparents in their prime. It was nostalgic and comforting. But then I found the journals. They were in her study, lined up on a shelf behind her desk. At first, I thought they were just old diaries. Minerva was the type to keep track of everything, and I figured they'd be full of harmless musings about her life. I wasn't snooping. I swear I wasn't. I just wanted to know more about her. The first few entries were normal. She wrote about family dinners, garden parties at Redwood Hollow, and trips she took in the 1970s. But the more I read, the more I realized how calculating she was. She didn't just write about events, she wrote about people. Analyzed them, really. She had sharp opinions about everyone in the family, including my dad. That's where things started to take a turn. My father, Elias, was always a sore spot in the family. He was reckless and irresponsible, the black sheep of the clan. He lost the family shipping company in the 1980s after a series of bad investments and shady business deals. Minerva used to shake her head and say he ruined everything, but I never blamed him entirely. He had enemies, men who betrayed him, swindled him, and took advantage of his weaknesses. He died penniless when I was 25, and I'd always believed he was a victim of his own bad luck. Minerva's journals told a very different story. One entry from 1983 stopped me in my tracks. She wrote, "Elias is an embarrassment. I warned him not to trust Roderick Vesper, but he was too stubborn to listen. Letting Vesper take control is for the best. Elias can't be trusted with the company, and Redwood Hollow must be protected at all costs." I read that paragraph over and over, my hands shaking. Roderick Vesper was the man who destroyed my father. He was my dad's business partner, the one who orchestrated the hostile takeover of our shipping company. My dad used to rant about him, calling him a backstabber and a thief. And here was proof that Minerva helped him do it. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Minerva, the matriarch who claimed to care so much about family, had worked with my dad's enemy to destroy him. I thought it might just be a misunderstanding, but as I kept reading, the picture became clearer and darker. Minerva wasn't just an innocent bystander. She actively sabotaged my father. She fed information to Vesper, undermined my dad's credibility with investors, and even manipulated the legal battles that followed the takeover. There were entire entries where she detailed her plans, writing about how she had to sacrifice Elias for the greater good. She didn't even sound guilty. She sounded proud. I spent hours poring over the journals, searching for some kind of justification. Maybe she thought my dad really was incompetent, or maybe she believed she was protecting the family. But the more I read, the more I realized it wasn't about the family. It was about her. She wanted control. She wanted to make sure Redwood Hollow, and the family legacy, stayed under her thumb, no matter the cost. And my dad? He was just collateral damage. Things got worse from there. A week later, while clearing out the attic, I found a locked trunk buried under a pile of old furniture. It was heavy and dusty, and I had to use a crowbar to pry it open. Inside were stacks of letters, all carefully preserved. Most were addressed to Minerva, but some were written by her. The letters revealed an even bigger conspiracy. Minerva had been in contact with not just Roderick Vesper, but several of my dad's other rivals. She provided them with insider information, coordinated their efforts, and even funneled money to lawyers who worked against my father in court. There was a level of detail in those letters that made my stomach churn. She didn't just betray him, she dismantled him. One letter from Vesper stood out. It read, "Minerva, as always, your insight is invaluable. Elias never saw it coming. The company will be in my hands by the end of the year, and I'll make sure your share of the trust remains intact. Your loyalty is impressive, and I hope you know how much I appreciate it." Her share of the trust. She sold out her own son to protect her wealth. To protect Redwood Hollow. I couldn't stop shaking as I read letter after letter. Minerva had orchestrated my father's ruin, and she didn't even try to hide it. She kept these letters, these journals, as if they were trophies, proof of her cunning, her power. It made me sick. And then I found something even worse. Mixed in with the letters were notes about me. Minerva had been watching me my entire life. She knew about my struggles in school, my failed marriage, and even the time I got arrested for a DUI. There were letters from people I hadn't spoken to in years, an old teacher, an ex-girlfriend, even a former boss. They all mentioned Minerva, like she'd been pulling strings behind the scenes, shaping my life without my knowledge. One note, written by her just a year before she died, sent me over the edge. "Vance is too much like Elias. Too soft, too sentimental. He lacks the strength to carry on the family legacy. I've done what I can to set him on the right path, but I have my doubts. If he fails, it won't be my fault." All this time, I thought Minerva believed in me. I thought she trusted me to carry on her legacy. But she didn't. She thought I was weak. She thought I was a failure before I even had the chance to prove myself. I don't know what to do now. The journals, the letters, they've shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. About Minerva. About myself. Redwood Hollow is still here, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. It feels like a monument to betrayal, to everything my grandmother destroyed in the name of control. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Sell the house? Burn it to the ground? Try to rebuild something good from the ashes? Because right now, I'm lost. Completely and utterly lost. I took some time before deciding what to do. Days turned into weeks, then months. Redwood Hollow loomed over me, its shadows longer and darker every time I walked through its halls. At first, I thought I'd sell it, just walk away and leave it all behind. But every time I tried to list it, I hesitated. Selling felt too easy. Too clean. And if there's one thing my grandmother taught me, intentionally or not, it's that legacy doesn't go away just because you try to ignore it. No, this wasn't just about selling a house or moving on. This was about undoing what she did. This was about justice. Revenge. And not just for me, for my father, too. He spent his life fighting enemies he didn't even realize were sitting at the family dinner table. He deserved better. We both did. I decided to stay. But I wasn't going to live in Minerva's shadow. I was going to dismantle her legacy, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the empire she thought she'd built. The first thing I did was call the town historical society. Redwood Hollow was practically a landmark in Hannibal, but only because of Minerva's relentless self-promotion. She spent decades spinning tales about our family's importance, making sure everyone in town saw us as royalty. I had other plans. I handed over the journals. The letters. Every piece of damning evidence I found. I told them I wanted the truth about my grandmother to be known, not the sanitized version she'd carefully cultivated, but the real story. The lies. The betrayals. The dirty deals she made to protect herself. At first, they were hesitant. Minerva had been a major donor to the Historical Society, and they didn't want to tarnish her reputation. But once they started reading through the journals, they couldn't ignore the story. They published an article in the local paper, a scathing exposé about Minerva's role in destroying her own son and manipulating the town's perception of our family. The backlash was immediate. People who'd once praised her couldn't look at her name without spitting. Her legacy was ruined. The foundation she'd spent her entire life building was crumbling, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Next, I turned my attention to the family trust. Minerva had tied up so much of her wealth in legal knots, ensuring Redwood Hollow would stay in the family forever. She thought she was being clever, but she underestimated my ability to untangle those knots. I hired a lawyer, an expensive one, and together we dug through every clause, every loophole, every dusty old document tied to the estate. It took months, but eventually, we found a way to dissolve the trust. Once that was done, I sold off every last piece of the estate's assets. The stocks. The bonds. The antiques Minerva cherished so much. It all went on the auction block. The money didn't go back into the family. I donated every cent to local charities, particularly those that helped people who'd been swindled or left behind by corrupt business practices. It felt fitting, turning Minerva's ill-gotten gains into something that actually helped people. Redwood Hollow itself was next. I thought about tearing it down, but that seemed too dramatic, too wasteful. Instead, I sold it to a developer who planned to turn it into an event space. Weddings, banquets, parties, exactly the kind of thing Minerva would have hated. She'd spent her whole life keeping the house exclusive, private, and now strangers would be dancing in the ballroom she used to guard like a dragon hoarding gold. I couldn't think of a more poetic end for the place. With the estate dismantled, there was one last thing to do: clear my father's name. I spent weeks researching the history of his shipping company, piecing together records that showed how he'd been betrayed. I even tracked down Roderick Vesper, who was still alive, though retired and living in some gaudy mansion in Florida. At first, Vesper refused to talk to me. He claimed he didn't remember much about my father, that it was all just business. But when I showed him copies of Minerva's letters, the ones proving she was the mastermind behind the takeover, his tone changed. He was nervous, fumbling over his words, trying to justify his actions. I didn't want his excuses. I wanted the truth. And when I threatened to leak the letters to the press, he finally gave me what I needed: a signed statement admitting that my father had been set up. That the takeover wasn't about incompetence or bad business decisions. It was a coordinated attack, orchestrated by my grandmother and carried out by Vesper. I took that statement straight to the local paper. Within days, the story was everywhere. For the first time in decades, my father's name was cleared. People who'd once mocked him as a failure were apologizing, admitting they'd been wrong. It didn't bring him back, but it felt like justice. With the estate gone, the trust dissolved, and my father's reputation restored, I finally felt like I could move on. Redwood Hollow wasn't my burden anymore. My grandmother's shadow didn't hang over me. For the first time in years, I felt free. I took the last of my own savings and moved to a quiet town a few hours away. I didn't want to rebuild the Redwood name or carry on the family legacy. That legacy was poison, and I wanted no part of it. Instead, I started fresh. A simple house, a simple job, and a life where I didn't have to worry about secrets lurking in the attic. Minerva thought she could control everything, even from beyond the grave. But in the end, all she did was destroy herself. Her empire is gone. Her name is tarnished. And me? I'm finally free of her. That's the story, Reddit. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I did it. I tore down everything she built, piece by piece, and made sure the truth came out. My father deserved that. I deserved that. And now, for the first time in my life, I feel like I can finally move on.